Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our live session today. My name is Larissa. I'm an event planner at Reactor, joining you from Sao Paulo in Brazil. Before we start, I have some quick housekeeping. Please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We seek to provide a respectful environment for both our audience and presenters. While we absolutely encourage engagement in the chat, we ask that you please be mindful of your commentary, remain professional and on topic. The session is being recorded and will be available to view on demand here on the Reactor YouTube channel within 48 hours. Keep an eye on the chat. We'll be dropping helpful links and checking for questions for our presenter to answer. I will now turn it over for our speaker for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm sure everyone can, at least someone can hear me. Just some sort of a confirmation that someone can hear me would be great. I can actually see that. All right, happy days. So good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to session number 6 of our Azure Developer Certification, a series that we are doing. I hope that you've found some value in some of these sessions, at least. I have to be honest with you, 1 hour is a very short amount of time for covering some of these topics. So if you want to prep for the exam, I'm probably going to just, outline concepts on these 1 hour sessions, and then you're going to have to drill a little bit deeper into the course material for that matter, in that context. And to the point there, you can see that if we look at this learning path, for example, from today, explore Microsoft Authentication Library, take a look at all these details here, right? You can see there's different authentication flows, right? We don't recommend you use implicit grant anymore, right? There's a variety of different options. I cannot talk to all of these items in 1 hour, right? So just be mindful of that. All right, our agenda just briefly. We're going to introduce Entra ID. What is Entra ID? Why do you want to use it? What are some of the main features of Entra ID? Then we will talk about MSAL, and I don't like using abbreviations like this on my agenda, but it's a monster name, so it'll scroll all the way to my car out here. The Microsoft Authentication Library is an open source library that we've built around Entra ID authentication specifically, right? So you want to generate a token for for authentication purposes, or for access purposes rather. MSAL is your way to go. However, we've also got another library that wraps the MSAL library. If you're interested in Microsoft Office data, Office 365 data, Dynamics 365 data, information from your Microsoft Graph, then the Graph SDK actually wraps the MSAL library. So if you need access to your inbox, to your calendar, to your SharePoint information, your OneDrive data, you can use the Microsoft Graph service. The Graph service has got built-in authentication that piggybacks off the Microsoft Authentication Library and allows you to access some of that data and even bring in some third-party data for that matter. It is, by the way, Microsoft Graph that we are using for interacting with your Office data if you are using something like Microsoft 365 Copilot. It's the Graph that's bringing through that information from your inbox and your OneDrive and these locations. So what is Entra ID? And before I get into this specific slide, I do think it's worth just popping something else onto the screen here. All right. This is a very old picture. I've updated it in the middle there, so it says Entra ID. It used to say Azure Active Directory, but this is a very common sort of diagram that you might see that outlines some of the capabilities we've got in Entra ID. Now, keep in mind that traditionally these services have come from our on-prem stack, right? Windows Active Directory services. And we've got a synchronization service that will synchronize some of your users and some of your groups from on-prem into the cloud if you wanted to do that. But you can also create your cloud users just in the cloud natively, right? there's some bring your own device type capabilities that you can see there. Windows 10 plus devices can essentially be joined directly to Entra ID, giving me a single sign-on type capability. But we can also manage some of your Android and Apple type devices, reset the device if the device has been compromised. We've essentially got my pen is right here. We've essentially got, you can really refer to this as a business to business and almost a business to consumer type capability, right? We've removed the wording business to B2C, so the wording is not there anymore. But if you want to deal with end users and consumers and customers of your application, we've got that component in there as well, and you can authenticate using even social media type accounts. We can redirect to third-party providers, and third-party providers can redirect to us, right? So for example, you end up on the salesforce.com application, authenticate there, it's actually redirecting to Entra ID, and you're heading back to Salesforce once you've actually authenticated. Entra ID provides the base and cornerstone of our tenants. So when you sign up for your first Office 365 service, if you sign up for Azure for the very first time, we will ask you for your business email address. And if it's johan@contoso.com, we will actually go and check to see if there's a contoso.onmicrosoft.com. And if that domain already exists, there's already someone that has created either an Azure or an Office 365 or an Intune or a Dynamics 365 subscription. You will only have one Entra ID tenant typically that contains these, but it will service all your Office 365 applications and services. That entire Microsoft cloud-based ecosystem is driven off our identity component. It's a core feature there. And then something they might talk to us a little bit later on is conditional access. The ability to say, hang on for a second, we're always going to be using this application from this IP address. We're always going to be using this IP, from this location. We're always going to be using this service from there. So if a user is logging on from a location that is not trusted in that context, we can always say, no, we don't trust it. The user is not on one of our trusted locations. Prompt the user for multi-factor authentication. We've even got some additional identity protection components that allow us to drop some agents on your on-prem domain controllers, allowing us to revert to reporting and alerts. For example, Johan has just signed in from New Zealand, and 20 minutes later, he's signed in from South Africa. That's not possible. So we can raise issues like that as well. There's also the component of PIM. It's not really part of the Azure Developer course, but I think it's important to understand with privileged identity management, I might have the privilege of managing users and resetting passwords, but it's not the default state of my account. So when I need to reset a password, I go into PIM, I say, hey, I need to reset users' passwords. I get the privilege for an hour or 2 hours or whatever that life cycle is, and after that lifespan, my privileges disappear again. So again, there's lots of things we can do and build around Entra ID. So for developers though, Entra ID is basically OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect compliant resources and services and endpoints that you can use by implementing standard internet-based protocols. So Entra ID is not Active Directory on-prem that uses LDAP under the covers with organizational units and things like this. It's a completely cloud-native, cloud-first service that Microsoft built from the ground up. Everything driven by open source libraries, as I keep mentioning, loads of different endpoints for generating your tokens and refresh tokens and things like this. but also a variety of different management portals, APIs, and other types of tooling and options for things like DevOps integration and that sort of thing. And I might demo some of that if we have time towards the end. Talking about DevOps, if you wanted to, for example, interact with your Azure resources from something like GitHub, then you will also use some of these resources, app registrations, but you'll have to specifically tell it, I want to federate this application with, with something like GitHub. So first things first here, if you want to start using some of this capability, you're essentially going to, create a service principal, and a service principal is going to give you some of that OpenID, Connect, and other credentials that you might be able to use. We are dealing here with both the authentication as well as the access control behind that, right? So it's not just about authenticating, it's also about controlling the consent to whatever you want to access in your application. Auth-in as well as auth-z in that context, right? Authentication and authorization. I alluded to conditional access, but you'll have to drill down a little bit deep into the material for this. There's an entire 1 or 2 pages around conditional access where they've got some scenarios they refer to, right? If the user is accessing from this scenario, they're going to have to do multi-factor authentication. So in order to do this and to programmatically leverage some of these options, you have to essentially go into Entra ID and you have to create something known as an app registration. I'm going to show that to you quickly. I'm going to pop into my portal here. You can see I'm going to go to Entra ID here. And you can see that there's something called app registrations. Right, and if I go to app registrations, you'll see it shows me 2 owned applications, right? But there's actually a load of them. If I go for all applications, you will actually see that there's actually quite a couple, all right? It's just that I've only been made owner of 2 of them, which is why it shows under owned applications here. So what I'm going to do here, folks, is I'm going to click on new app registration, and I want to point out immediately that you decide who's going to be using this application. Is it going to be users just from our tenant? Is it going to be users from our tenant and possibly a supplier or other customers of ours that might be using this application, right? Is it going to be multi-tenant and also personal Microsoft accounts? So for example, if you've got some customers that buy your application, you're not going to ask them to log in with their corporate credentials. You're going to ask them to log in with their personal credentials. And to this end, we can point it to a personal account. And we can allow personal accounts, Microsoft personal accounts, to authenticate. We can even bring in social media accounts if we wanted to. In this case, I'm going to go with a single tenant here. I'm quite content with that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go for a redirect URI here. And I'm going to pop something in here that says localhost 5001. To this end, you're probably going to realize immediately that Johan is planning to do the demo with an app running locally on this device. And that certainly is the plan. I'm going to click on, I'm going to give it a name. Let's go Jazz 204 to delete again. Running a little bit low on names here. Click on register there. This will register the application. And if I just open up Notepad here quickly, then I'll be able to go and copy some of this information. Now for OpenID Connect, you need a couple of things. You need something called an application or a client ID, right? There is a client ID. You need something called a directory or tenant ID. If I wanted to interact with Azure resources, I might also need the Azure subscription ID for that matter, right? What's the subscription I want to deal with? Okay, so there you can see I'm going to copy some of these options. There's the client ID. I'm going to copy the client ID. The tenant ID stays the same, but if I scroll down here, you can see that there's something called certificates and secrets. I can go and churn out a secret here, 180 days. Happy days. Hit the add button. There's my secret. Let me just pop the secret in here as well into my notepad on the side. There you can see I alluded to federated credentials. You can see I can go and say, yeah, I want this to be accessible from a Kubernetes service, or I want to use this identity to deploy from GitHub Actions for that matter, right? For those scenarios, you're going to have to do some setup here, and you can see you have to point it to your repo and things in GitHub. If I go to GitHub though, and I go look at my Docker application, and I head over to my GitHub Actions here, there you can see new AKS deploy. I can deploy to Kubernetes I can deploy a Kubernetes cluster in my GitHub Actions. Why? Because at this point in time, I'm doing an Azure login, and you can see all I'm doing is I'm logging in with my client ID, the tenant ID, and there's my subscription ID. Okay, so we've got some good integration here from third-party services, and for the most part, you can kind of make it happen from those different environments. I'm going to close that out. The last thing I want to chat about here just quickly is I alluded to permissions and consent. Right? As I said, it's not just about signing in, it's about authorizing, right, certain scenarios. And you can see here that if I go for API permissions, that I'm actually quite content. In this case, it's going to say I want to read your user profile, but I can go and add some additional permissions, right? There you can see the Microsoft Graph permissions. There's some organizational. If I go for application items, I can go and search there for mail, for example, and you can see there's a mail read option. If I wanted the user and the application to access their email, for example, I can access their mail. I have to go and ask the user consent. The user will actually be prompted for consent in this context. I'm not going to add that. Actually, I'm going to just leave it as it is. At this point in time, I'm quite happy. I've got the details I want. So I can now use this credential set to access some resources and to identify my application. Next part here for us to chat about is now that I've got my application registration and my credentials, essentially, I want to start leveraging this in my application now. And the way to do this is to use the Microsoft Authentication Library, or MSAL, as it's also known. Way back, we had something called ADAL, but that was just a single tenant service, and I think it's completely been deprecated now. You're going to be using MSAL, and this is also what's tested for in this exam. So if you're using our MSAL library, and I've tried to at least pop all the different frameworks and platforms that we can use for this. On the right-hand side, you can see we cater there for Node, for Python, for React. There's even a MSAL Go that's in preview currently, but there's also a MSAL JS, which you might be using for those single-page applications, right? MSAL.js. Okay, so what is this MSAL library? It is essentially an authentication library that allows me to interact and send my users and my applications and services for authentication. To this end, you'll notice that you don't have to directly use OAuth or any of those libraries, right? We're going to handle all of this, right? You don't have to code against the actual protocol. You also don't have to worry about tokens, right? So MSAL will, on behalf of your application and user, get the tokens, store the tokens, and even refresh the tokens if that's something that you're not doing in your code. Maintains that token cache and also refreshes the tokens. There are various authentication flows that's available through this service. And our graph service even extends on that slightly if you think about it in that context. I'm going to click on a link here. It's effectively the same link that I was on earlier, but you will notice that if I scroll down, there's all the frameworks and applications, and there's all the different authentication flows. Most important ones here, probably authorization flow, where the user signs in and accesses APIs, and the application accesses APIs on behalf of the user. Other one that's probably also quite relevant nowadays, if you were building apps for stuff like TVs and devices like that, where you don't want your user to be wrestling with something like a remote control. Have you ever tried to type a complex password with a remote control? It's like, it breaks your mind a little bit, right? I definitely don't have the thumbs for that. But you can also see a couple of these have been deprecated. There's on behalf of, and a couple of other options. Right, so be aware of some of these flows. You're not always going to have a user logging in. I'll see if I can demonstrate that for you a little bit later on as well. So some of the more prevalent ones, device code on behalf of, integrated Windows authentication as well. And there you can see what we basically have to do in .NET, at least. We have to create something called a confidential client application. And a confidential client application we can build by using the client ID, the client secret, and the redirect URI. So I'll see if I can demonstrate some of this for you just briefly. I've got my application now. I'm going to go for something called Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to just crack it open here. I have to guess where it's going to come up. So here's an application, and I've got a domain, I've got a tenant ID. Hello, there's a client ID. If you want to take a look at that, I'm going to just pop this out. Here's the client ID. Ta-da! It's going to prompt me for a secret here somewhere. There we go. There's a secret. It is a monster secret. And my subscription ID is actually going to stay the same. So in this case, what I've done here, and I don't think I'm going to go into the details here, but you can see there that add author, add Microsoft Identity Web App, builder.configuration get section is going to read in some of that information. And then further to this, it's essentially going to spin up that scenario, and it's going to allow my user to authenticate. This is one of the labs you might be doing for this course. If you look at the labs that I shared in those links, I'm just going to do a .NET run here. And you can see, wrong URL. To pop up this one. Here we go. You can see it's prompting me to sign in here. I can sign in with my corporate account. I know what's gone wrong there. I know exactly what's gone wrong there. I'm going to go to authentication here, and under settings, switch to the old experience, and I'm going to add another URL here. Sign in, log out. That's the log out channel, and I didn't specify that. Yes. Save that, and let's just try again. There we go. Remember, that in that app registration of mine, it actually prompted me. There was one of the access options was the profile view. Remember this. If I go to API permissions, that user read, sign in and read the user profile. That is why I'm getting this now. Sign in and read your basic profile. If I had another requirement in there, and I also said, sign in and read your email, get your calendar information, for example, it will also do that for me, right? I can hit the accept button here, and now my user is signed in, and I'm not going to show resource groups here. I'm not going to set that up. I'll do that in my next demo. So at this point in time, I'm signed in, and you can see I'm signed in with that user. It's looking pretty good. I'm quite content. But I've linked it up with the application and the user now. The user has signed in using that application. So this is a very common scenario, right? You might have access to the application up until the point where you need to do something, and then we can prompt the user for authentication. The user signs in, and the application gets some access based on the user credential. All right, so that's definitely one option. I'm going to shut this down, and I'll show you another flow just quickly. All right, we'll clear this out, and I'll go open folder, open recent. There we go. There's something called, which one was it? This one. Azure integration. So with this application, I'm doing something completely different. With this application, I'm not signing in a user. With this application, I'm going to sign in the application. Check there, client ID, client secret, confidential client application builder.create, using the client ID, using the secret. There you can see with URI, login.microsoft.com, and I'm using a specific tenant ID for that. And then you can see there's my scopes, acquire token for client using that scope, and that gives me the result. And then you can see that every time we are going to interact with management.azure.com, I'm creating a named HTTP client here actually. And this named HTTP client, every time I use Azure services in any of my pages, it's going to inject that bearer token, and that request will have the access token available. So in this instance here, I'm signing in as the application. There's no user in sight here. Signing in as the application, and the application has got access, right? Now, at this point in time, you're probably thinking, well, if the application has access, let's see some of that access, right? Let's actually see if we can make this happen. So I'm going to try to do that quickly. I'm going to replace my app settings. I'm going to go with client ID. Pop in the client ID from here. That's the client ID. And then my client secret. Let's save that out. And I'm just going to do a .NET run here. So now there's no user in sight here, right? No user. I'm signing in as the application, and the application has got access. It actually is not going to have access. I'll show you how I can give it access in a few minutes. So I'm going to head over to my local host here. Here's localhost. Hello. You can see if I click on management groups, it's empty. If I click on resource groups, it's empty. All right. Now, remember this Jazz 204 to delete again. This is the app registration that I created, right? I'm going to go to the root management group that I've got in my Azure structure. There's the tenant root. There's access control. And I'm going to add a new assignment. Going to give reader permissions to this application of mine. Here we go. Jazz 204 to delete again. So what am I doing here? The one component is authentication. What am I doing here? I'm authorizing this application to have access to my environment, isn't it? So I'll click on review and assign. It'll take a few seconds for this to get churned out. And you should see within a few seconds here, if I go for resource groups, there's my resource groups coming through. There's my management groups. It should come through any minute now. There's, again, some resource groups. That's a little bit sporadic here. In actual fact, what I'll do is I'll just shut it down and just run it again. And you'll see it'll be a little bit more consistent here. Ah, come on. What's it? Port 5144. There we go. There's management groups. It's going to show the management groups now because I've got access to the management groups. There's the resource groups. It's going to show the resource groups because I've got access to those resource groups. There you can see the individual services. I haven't yet mapped everything out properly, but that's the plan, is to eventually have it mapped out like this. But you can see there that, I've registered the application. That gave me the set of credentials that I need. Once I've registered the application, I can, I've got the credentials and I can go and give it the exact access that I need to give to it. All right. So one last quick demo before I pop over to the last slide. I've got one more demo that I want to give to you. I think this demo is going to break, but it'll at least show you the intent. Right, so I'm going to open a folder quick. I think it is that one. I think it's this one. There we go. It is this one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop that client ID in there as well. So this is just another flow that I want to demonstrate for you. It is going to break because it hasn't been updated in a very, very long time. This, I think, is going to be that redirect option there. All right. So I know this is going to I know this is going to break up to a point. All right. So let's see if we can run this quick. Definitely bleating about things that are out of date here. But this, you can see here, this device code provider, I'm using the Microsoft Graph service here to authenticate. There you can see Microsoft Graph, graph.auth. I'm using the Graph service here, but you should see within a few seconds, because I'm using the device code provider, it's not going to prompt me to authenticate. It's actually going to say to me, here's a code, here's a URL. Go with another device to that URL, type in the code, and then authenticate using that device. There we go. There you can see at the bottom there. There's the URL. All I have to do is copy that. I'm going to go to this device login. Ooh, hang on. I just want to paste it in there quickly. There's device login. I just have to drop that code in there. Where's the code? Thank you very much. Here's the code. It's going to break at this point in time. Very, very soon now, it's going to break, I'm sure. You can sign in there quickly. Looks like it's happy days. Other ways to sign in here. Gosh. And you can see that it's doing exactly the same thing again, right? Sign in with your profile, accept this, and Bob is your uncle. You've signed in. I suspect at this point in time, yeah, it might break a little bit. Anyway, it's actually some old code, but you can see it, it's really just an authentication component. And then the last thing for us to chat about, we've spoken about what is Entra ID. We've spoken about these app registrations and the value they've given to us. We've spoken now about the Microsoft Authentication Library. You're going to have to do a little bit more digging in this area. Make sure you know the endpoint URLs, etc. And then the last thing is really just the Microsoft Graph. Now, I really love the Microsoft Graph. I'll be honest with you, as cheesy as that sounds. But if I go search for something like MS Graph Explorer, there's a Graph Explorer. And this is why this is so valuable for your applications and services, but also why it's so valuable for Copilot, right? Because Copilot, essentially, if I'm writing queries for Copilot in Microsoft 365 Copilot, and I say, I wonder if I've got an email I need to reply to. Guess what Copilot's going to do? It's going to go off to your Outlook mail, and it's going to run a query like this: my mails from an address, track an email change, right? Get email headers. It's going to run a query. It's going to return some of that information. And keep in mind that the graph only has access to what you've got access to. So you can see in this case, if I go to getting started, my profile, and I run this query, I don't know why it's all in pink here. It is a little bit weird. There you can see, it's giving me some bogus information here based on Adele Vance, right? There you can see there's request body, the request headers, etc. So the Microsoft Graph service wraps most of your Microsoft 365 data, but also wraps this MSAL authentication library of ours, right? Extends it a little bit in terms of authentication flows. And then from there, you can see that you can also bring in Microsoft Graph connectors. These Microsoft Graph connectors are essentially integration points that we bring in with external and third-party data and applications. But you can also bring in something called Graph Connect. And the Graph Connect service effectively allows me to bring in massive amounts of data. So maybe you're, wanting to query something in Cosmos DB in Azure, for example. We can use this Graph Data Connect component to actually bring in those large data sets and interact through the Graph service with those large chunks of data. I've also at the bottom here, I've also just given you a little REST endpoint, right? Where you can see get graph.microsoft.com, a specific version if you like, and filter. And you can see towards the end there, we can run standard filters. This is almost like an OData type filter, right? So you can filter data based on these standard OData filters that you might be using. And that's the Graph service. That last authentication component that I showed you with the device login, that was actually using the Graph service to authenticate. But I wanted you to notice that it's using that same application registration for that scenario. And a very short and sweet one today. but it's very difficult for me to get deeper into some of these topics without going over my 1 hour time period. But if I can maybe just conclude this for us before we open the floor for some questions. Right, we're talking here about authentication as well as authorization using these, app registrations. We will talk in a bit more detail, next week around, what if my services are in Azure and only in Azure? Are there other ways of providing identity for those services? So we will talk about managed identity in a bit more detail next week. I think I've got a guest speaker for next week that will take that session. But Entra ID gives you a variety of different SDKs that you might be using for not only authenticating but authorizing, access to data. We've got some great federation capabilities that also sit in those frameworks and platforms, and you can really use it for most types of application architectures. We're talking about server-side compute. We're talking about single-page applications with the MSAL JavaScript file, etc. We cater for all those types of applications. Some of the key concepts for you to master here: make sure you got your head around app registrations. Make sure, for example, as well, that you don't just use this in the portal, right? If I just back up here just slightly and I head over to something like PowerShell, I'm going to create one of these accounts here. I don't know why that's not happening. There we go. You can see that this is effectively the command that you'll be running in order to create an app registration programmatically, right? You can see there I've got AZ-AD service principal. I honestly don't know why they call it a service principal in this context. Create for role-based access control. You can see the name. I can type in there anything like my app reg, right? Also to delete, in case I forget to do that. And then you can see I can give it some scopes, right? That is a scope for a subscription. So I'm going to update that actually. And I'm going to head over to my notepad here. Just want to copy the subscription ID. There we go. And I'm giving the role contributor. It's creating a contributor role. And you will see that this is exactly the same as creating the app registration in the portal, except I've done it now from the command line, right? And if I go and copy that and head back to the portal here, and I go back to my app registrations, you're going to see that there's the my app to delete. It's the same thing, whether I'm using the portal to create the app registration or whether I'm using the command line tools. For exams, they might ask you in the exam, hey, you're executing this command, and then they might actually say something like this: scopes might be a drop down. And then they're going to give you 3 options to choose from, and you have to see, oh, this is the scope. So choose the scopes option, not something else. Right? They will try to catch you out a little bit like that in the exam. So as per usual, when you're prepping for the exam, for every service we talk about in this series, make sure you know how to create those resources using the PowerShell and CLI commands. Partially, why I've got my course content in every slide that I start. You can see there's a PowerShell folder, and under PowerShell, there's my AZ204 script, and you can see that we've got virtually everything here. There's things, event grid, there's going to be how to create an event grid, how to create the API management service, how to create Redis cache, which is not part of the course anymore. All right, so it's actually all there. And that brings me more or less to the end of this this session. Let's see if we have any questions. It was a quick one, a little bit quicker than I would have liked, actually.
Johan, we have a question from, I hope I'm not pronouncing your name incorrectly. If I am, I'm sorry. Niraj. They ask, can these attributes client's ID be made aware for multiple tenant apps?
Yeah, 100%. I think I had that on the slides. You can see there when I'm creating this, I can specify single multi-tenant. So yeah, absolutely. Okay, Narij or Niraj, did that answer your question? I hope so. Any further questions, folks?
Not yet. I don't know if you wanna give any last messages for them or any last advices while we wait if there's any more questions coming up.
So I see that Ellie mentioned there 1 hour is not enough for most AZ204 chapters. Why don't you open it for more than 1 hour? Generally, we stick to 1 hour in the reactor sessions. The reactor sessions are not supposed to be longer sessions. But to be honest with you, if that's something that you might actually provide as feedback to some of these sessions. So I think from my side, I'm actually quite flexible. It's just that's what we're used to doing. But you're 100% right. You need to treat these more as an introduction to the learning path than covering the entire learning path. Also, sometimes our customers don't have access to do some of the labs. They don't have subscriptions and things like that. So at the very least on these sessions, you get to see some demos and examples of how these services actually work. So hopefully it is useful, Ellie, despite the fact that it's a short amount of time. Any further questions, folks? Okay, so I do want to thank you. Next week, I'm going to have a colleague of mine is presenting the session around secure applications. So I'm hoping to see you folks the week after that. Have a great afternoon. I hope that was useful for you. Go and do some further digging into authentication, and we will chat a little bit later on, possibly the week after next. Enjoy. Stick around, maybe see if there's some more questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining our session today. If you have any questions, please feel free to send out to Thank you, everyone, for joining our session today. I didn't realize, Johan, I was on mute before. If you didn't hear me, I'm sorry about that. Thank you all for joining, and thank you to our speaker for today. We are always looking to improve our sessions and your experience. So if you have any feedback for us, we would love to hear what you have to say. You can find the link in the chat or on the screen, and we'll see you on the next one.